Power usually bends the knee, but what happens when the city's most dangerous man gets utterly dismissed by a woman who refuses to fit the plastic mold? Bloodshed is common, but bruised egos are rare. This is how one ignored glance ignited a terrifying obsession. Neon lights bled through the arched windows of Zero Bond Manhattan's most exclusive private club. The air inside was thick with the scent of Tom Ford cologne, spilled champagne, and desperate ambition. For Penelope Hayes, it was just another suffocating Friday night she had been manipulated into attending. Penelope was not the typical Zero Bond clientele. In a sea of size zero models, aspiring actresses, and trust fund socialites who subsisted on vodka and air, Penelope was unapologetically fat. At 240 pounds, she carried her weight with a quiet, grounded dignity that usually made people uncomfortable. She didn't shrink herself. She wore a deep emerald velvet wrap dress that clung to her curves, her dark hair pinned up in a loose French twist. She knew she was beautiful, but she also knew how New York worked to the men holding the black American Express cards. In this room she was invisible, and that was exactly how she liked it. "Penny, please just look alive," her best friend, Holly, hissed aggressively, adjusting her own microscopic sequined dress. Holly was an up-and-coming PR executive who saw every party as a battlefield. "Do you know who is supposed to be here tonight, the Romano family?" Penelope took a slow sip of her sparkling water, entirely unbothered. "Holly, I appraise antique jewelry for Christie's. Unless one of the Romanos is bringing me a 17th century Tsar diamond to evaluate, I genuinely do not care about organized crime. It's not just organized crime, it's Cassian Romano." Holly whispered, her eyes darting frantically toward the VIP section. "He controls the port unions, half the real estate in Tribeca, and supposedly he's the reason that state senator resigned last month. He's lethal, and he's gorgeous." "He sounds like a walking federal indictment," Penelope replied dryly. "I'm going to the buffet. I saw them bring out those little truffle beef sliders, and I'm not letting a bunch of tech bros eat them all." As Penelope turned toward the sprawling marble catering table, the ambient noise of the club suddenly flatlined. The heavy oak doors of the private entrance had swung open. The shift in the room's energy was palpable, a collective holding of breath. Cassian Romano had arrived. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than Penelope's annual rent in Brooklyn, Cassian radiated quiet violence. His dark eyes swept the room with utter boredom. Flanking him were 4 men, heavily built and hypervigilant. But Cassian was the undisputed center of gravity. Instantly, the parting of the Red Sea began. Men stepped back respectfully, lowering their heads, while women subtly adjusted their posture, pushing chests out and tossing hair desperate for a fraction of his attention. It was a pathetic display of submission, a synchronized dance of desperation. Cassian's gaze drifted lazily over the crowd. He was used to this. The fear, the awe, the blatant invitations. It was tedious. Meanwhile, Penelope was on a mission. She had zero interest in the Mafia boss holding court by the entrance. Her eyes were locked on the silver platter of truffle sliders, sitting precariously close to the edge of the buffet table. The problem was Cassian, and his entourage had stopped directly in her path. Most people would have frozen. Most people would have backed away, waiting for the king to pass. Penelope didn't break stride. With a soft but firm, "Excuse me." She stepped directly in front of Cassian, completely blocking his view of the club. She didn't look up at his face. She didn't bat her eyelashes. She casually reached out, plucked the last truffle slider from the silver tray, took a satisfying bite, and walked right past him, the hem of her emerald dress brushing against his expensive trousers. She didn't look back. She simply walked away, chewing happily, heading toward the quietest corner of the lounge. For a terrifying 3 seconds, nobody breathed. One of Cassian's guards, a giant of a man named Matteo, instinctively shifted his weight, his hand moving toward the inside of his jacket. Someone had just disrespected the boss. Someone had just treated Cassian Romano like he was a piece of furniture in her way. Cassian held up a single black-gloved finger. Matteo froze. Cassian slowly turned his head, his sharp jawline tightening as he tracked the curvy woman in the green dress who was now settling into a velvet booth, completely oblivious to the heart attacks she had just caused across the room. He watched as she pulled out her phone, scrolling through it with utter indifference to his existence. He had never been ignored, not once in his 32 years of life. Women threw themselves at his feet. Men begged for his mercy. And yet this woman who defied every superficial standard of the city, who took up space unapologetically, had looked right through him for a miniature hamburger. A slow, dark smirk curved the edges of Cassian's mouth. The boredom that had plagued him all evening vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense thrill of the hunt. He leaned slightly toward his right-hand man, his eyes never leaving Penelope. "Matteo." Cassian murmured his voice, a low, dangerous gravel that promised ruin. "That one. Bring her to me." Penelope was halfway through an article about restoring Victorian brooches when a massive shadow fell over her table. She sighed internally, putting her phone down. Standing over her was a man built like a commercial refrigerator, wearing a tailored suit that strained across his shoulders. It was Matteo. He looked distinctly uncomfortable, as if he had been assigned a task he didn't quite understand. "Miss Matteo," said his voice, a deep rumble that vibrated over the thumping bass of the club's speakers. "Mr. Romano requests your presence in the VIP lounge." Penelope looked at Matteo. Then she looked past him, across the club, up to the elevated glass-paneled VIP section. Cassian was sitting on a leather sofa, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, looking directly down at her. He expected her to jump up. He expected her to tremble. Penelope turned her gaze back to the giant in front of her. "No, thank you," she said politely. Matteo blinked. It was a slow, confused blink. "I don't think you understand. Cassian Romano is asking for you." "I understand perfectly," Penelope replied, picking up her sparkling water. "I don't know Mr. Romano. I have no business with Mr. Romano, and I am not a dog to be summoned across a room because he snapped his fingers. So you can tell him, no thank you." Matteo shifted his weight, his expression hardening. "Miss, it wasn't a request. People don't say no to him." Penelope felt a flare of irritation heat her cheeks. She was incredibly tired of arrogant men thinking they owned the world. "Well, today is a day for firsts. If he wants to speak to me, his legs work just fine. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm waiting for my friend." Matteo hesitated. He was trained to break bones, to intimidate union bosses, and to collect debts. He was not trained to handle a stubbornly seated plus-sized appraiser who was politely refusing a Mafia boss. Unsure of how to proceed without causing a scene that Cassian explicitly despised, Matteo gave a stiff nod and retreated up the stairs. Penelope watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Did I really just do that?" she thought. But the adrenaline felt good. Up in the VIP section, she saw Matteo lean down and whisper into Cassian's ear. She watched as Cassian's posture shifted. The smirk faded, replaced by something much darker. He stood up. "Oh God," Penelope thought. "He's actually coming down." The crowd parted once again as Cassian descended the glass staircase. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He bypassed the eager socialites and walked directly to Penelope's secluded corner. He didn't ask for permission. He simply slid into the velvet booth directly across from her, trapping her in. Up close, he was terrifyingly handsome. Sharp cheekbones, a shadow of stubble, and eyes so dark they looked like endless voids. He smelled of smoke, bergamot, and danger. "I hear you have a problem with walking," Cassian said, his voice silky, dangerous, and incredibly close. "I have a problem with being summoned," Penelope corrected, forcing her voice to remain steady. She folded her hands on the table, refusing to shrink back against the booth. "I don't know who you are, Mr. Romano, beyond the ridiculous whispers of my friend. But I don't do command performances." Cassian leaned forward, invading her space. He looked at her intently, his gaze mapping the soft curves of her face, the fullness of her lips, and the unapologetic fire in her eyes. "You ignored me. Nobody ignores me." "I was hungry," Penelope deadpanned. "You were blocking the food. It wasn't a personal vendetta." A genuine, startling laugh escaped Cassian's chest. It was a harsh, rusted sound, as if he rarely used it. The sound caused his bodyguards to exchange shocked glances. "You are—" Cassian started tilting his head as he studied her. "You are completely out of place here." "So are you," Penelope shot back. "You look like you're trying to figure out which of these people you're going to tax first." Cassian's eyes flared with a dangerous mix of amusement and predatory interest. "What's your name?" "Penelope." "Penelope?" He tasted the name on his tongue. "I am Cassian." "I know. The whole room knows. Now, if you don't mind, my friend is waving at me from the coat check, and I want to go home to my cat and my sweatpants." Penelope grabbed her small clutch and began to slide out of the booth. Cassian didn't move to block her, but as she stood up, he caught her wrist. His grip was entirely gentle, yet completely immovable. "We are going to see each other again, Penelope," he said softly, a promise that sounded terrifyingly like a threat. "I doubt it," she replied, pulling her hand free. "We run in very different circles, Mr. Romano." She turned and walked away, grabbing a hyperventilating Holly by the arm and dragging her out into the crisp New York night air. Penelope hailed a cab, thinking she had just survived a bizarre one-off encounter with a narcissist. She thought she had won. She was terribly wrong. Monday morning arrived with the chaotic energy typical of Christie's auction house at Rockefeller Center. Penelope loved her job. As a senior appraiser of historical jewelry, she spent her days surrounded by tangible history, evaluating the worth of forgotten empires. She was currently examining a sapphire pendant when her boss, Richard, a usually unflappable snobbish man, burst into her office, looking pale and sweaty. Penelope dropped the pendant. Richard stammered, wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "We have a crisis. Or a miracle. I'm not sure which." "What is it, Richard?" Penelope asked, carefully setting the jewel on a velvet pad. "The Vander Woodson estate. The massive private collection in the Hamptons we've been trying to secure the appraisal rights to for 6 months. It was just bought out, completely, by a private buyer." Penelope frowned. "Bought out bypassing the auction house entirely? That's hundreds of millions of dollars." "Yes." Richard swallowed hard. "The new owner's holding company wired the money this morning. But there is a condition." "A condition for what?" "The buyer refuses to let the jewelry be transported. He wants a Christie's appraiser to come to his private estate in the Hamptons to catalogue and evaluate the entire collection on site. It's a 2-week job. And Penelope," Richard looked at her with wide, terrified eyes. "He specifically demanded you." Penelope felt a sudden, icy dread pool in her stomach. "Me, Richard, I don't do on-site field appraisals anymore. Send David. David loves the Hamptons." "He didn't ask for David," Richard nearly shrieked. "He specifically named Penelope Hayes. He said if you don't do it, he pulls the entire contract from Christie's and takes it to Sotheby's. Do you understand what that would do to my career? To this branch?" Penelope stood up, her pulse racing. "Richard, who is the buyer, what is the name of the holding company?" Richard looked down at the trembling file in his hands. "It's a subsidiary of Romano Holdings. The client's name is Cassian Romano." Penelope collapsed back into her chair, the air rushing from her lungs. "We are going to see each other again, Penelope." He hadn't been making idle conversation at the club. He hadn't just been a bruised ego trying to get the last word. The man had spent hundreds of millions of dollars over the weekend just to buy her workplace compliance. "Pack a bag, Penelope." Richard pleaded, completely oblivious to the danger he was sending her into. "A black car is picking you up in an hour." Penelope looked out the window at the bustling New York streets, realizing with a cold certainty that the invisible wall she had built around her quiet life had just been violently shattered. Gravel crunched under the heavy tires of the armored Mercedes Maybach as it rolled through the towering wrought-iron gates of Meadow Lane, Southampton. Penelope clutched her leather appraisal kit, her knuckles white. To her left, the churning grey waves of the Atlantic Ocean crashed against the private shoreline. To her right stood a sprawling modern fortress, disguised as a multi-million-dollar architectural masterpiece of glass and blackened steel. This was Cassian Romano's domain. The car came to a smooth halt. The door was instantly pulled open by Matteo, who looked just as massive and imposing in the daylight as he had in the neon glow of Zero Bond. "Miss Hayes," Matteo rumbled, offering a stiff nod. "Matteo," Penelope replied, stepping out of the vehicle. She was dressed for battle in her own way, a tailored wide-leg charcoal suit that flattered her thick thighs and a silk cream blouse that emphasized the soft, generous curves of her chest. She refused to dress down or hide herself, just because she had been forcefully drafted into a billionaire's psychological game. "I assume you have a secure room for the inventory." "The master library has been converted into a temporary vault," Matteo said, leading her up the sprawling limestone steps. "He is waiting for you." Penelope's stomach executed a nervous flip, but she pushed her shoulders back. Entering the mansion felt like stepping into a temperature-controlled museum. It was stark, beautiful, and completely devoid of warmth. Matteo led her down a long corridor lined with original Basquiat and Rothko paintings, finally pushing open a set of heavy mahogany double doors. The library was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, but Penelope's eyes were immediately drawn to the center of the room. A massive, felt-lined appraisal table had been set up, illuminated by professional daylight lamps. Upon it sat dozens of velvet trays, overflowing with the Vander Woodson collection, a dizzying array of Harry Winston diamonds, vintage Cartier Panthers, and heavy Victorian gold. And leaning against the edge of the table, arms crossed over his broad chest, was Cassian. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore a dark, fitted cashmere sweater that clung to the hard lines of his torso and tailored trousers. Without the formal armor, he looked raw, lethal, and devastatingly relaxed. "You made excellent time." Cassian observed his dark eyes, tracking her every movement as she walked into the room. "Traffic is surprisingly light when you have an armed escort clearing the Long Island Expressway," Penelope replied dryly, setting her heavy leather bag on a side table. She didn't offer a polite smile. She walked straight to the appraisal table and began pulling out her jeweler's loupe, her precision scale, and her cotton gloves. Cassian pushed off the table and took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "You are angry." "I am a professional," Penelope corrected, snapping on her white gloves. "I am here because you essentially held my employer hostage. I will catalogue this collection, certify its authenticity, and then I will return to my life." I don't care how much money you have, Mr. Romano. You cannot buy my enthusiasm." Cassian stopped just inches from her side. The scent of bergamot and expensive tobacco washed over her. He looked down at her, his gaze lingering on the stubborn set of her jaw before dragging slowly down to appreciate the plush, unapologetic curve of her hips beneath her tailored trousers. Most women in his world starved themselves to look like fragile, breakable things. Penelope looked like a Renaissance painting, soft, lush, and completely grounded. It drove him utterly insane. "I don't want your enthusiasm, Penelope." Cassian murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly octave that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "I want your attention, and I always get what I want." "Well, you have it for the next 14 days. Penelope shot back, refusing to break eye contact. "Now step back. You're blocking my light, and I have a mid-century Bulgari necklace to authenticate." For a moment, the air crackled with tension. Cassian's jaw ticked. Then a slow, dark smirk spread across his lips. He took a single step back, sliding his hands into his pockets. "As you wish. Proceed." For the next 4 days, a bizarre rhythm developed. Penelope worked meticulously from dawn until dusk, evaluating pieces worth millions. Cassian, to her intense frustration, rarely left the room. He sat in a wingback leather chair in the corner, holding meetings on a burner phone, drinking espresso and watching her. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched the way she chewed on her bottom lip when a gemstone proved difficult to grade. He watched her like a predator, studying its favorite prey. On the 5th afternoon, the rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Penelope was examining a heavy, remarkably ugly, 19th-century mourning brooch made of black onyx and gold. According to the manifest, it was an original piece commissioned by a minor Russian duchess. Penelope adjusted her loop, frowning. She ran her gloved thumb over the intricate gold backing. Something was wrong. The weight was uneven. She picked up her microscopic tweezers and gently pressed a tiny, almost invisible latch hidden within the gold filigree. With a soft click, the back of the brooch popped open. Penelope gasped. It wasn't a mourning locket. The hollowed-out center didn't contain a lock of hair or a miniature portrait. It contained a tightly rolled piece of modern, highly durable micro-mylar film. "Find something interesting." Cassian's voice came from directly behind her. She hadn't even heard him move. Penelope spun around, clutching the open brooch. "This collection. It's not just a status symbol for you, is it?" Cassian's eyes dropped to the open brooch in her hand. The amused, arrogant smirk he usually wore vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating mask. He looked like the monster Holly had warned her about. "No," Cassian said softly. "It is not." "What is this?" Penelope demanded, stepping back. "This isn't an antique inclusion. This is modern microfilm." Cassian stepped forward, cornering her against the appraisal table. He reached out not to take the brooch, but to gently wrap his large hand around her wrist. The Vanderwoodson patriarch was not just a wealthy socialite. He was a very quiet, very efficient money launderer for the Borelli family, my biggest competitors. When he died, the Borellis panicked. They knew he kept a master ledger of every corrupted politician, judge, and port authority official on the East Coast. But they couldn't find it. Penelope felt the blood drain from her face. He hid it in the jewelry collection. "Exactly," Cassian said, his thumb brushing over her racing pulse. "I bought the entire estate to legally confiscate it before the Borellis could tear the house apart. I needed a top-tier appraiser who was meticulous enough to find a needle in a pile of diamonds and stubborn enough not to ask questions." "You lied to me," Penelope whispered, anger flaring beneath her fear. "You didn't bring me here because I ignored you at a party. You brought me here to do your dirty work. Cassian's eyes darkened, a flash of genuine fury crossing his features. Do not mistake my motives, Penelope. I have 50 men on my payroll who could have dismantled this jewelry with a hammer to find that ledger. I demanded you because I couldn't get you out of my head. The ledger was business. You are a personal obsession. Before Penelope could process the heavy, terrifying weight of that confession, the library doors violently blew open. The concussive boom shattered the heavy glass of the ocean-facing windows. Rain and howling wind tore into the library, scattering millions of dollars worth of paperwork and velvet trays across the Persian rug. "Get down!" Cassian roared. In a fraction of a second, he lunged forward, wrapping his massive arms around Penelope's waist and tackling her behind the heavy solid oak of the appraisal table, just as a spray of bullets tore through the room, shredding the leather chair he had been sitting in moments prior. Penelope screamed, the sound drowned out by the deafening crack of automatic weapons. Dust and splintered wood rained down on her. Cassian was pressed heavily against her, shielding her body entirely with his own. He smelled of cordite and adrenaline. "Matteo!" Cassian shouted into the chaos. "Breach at the east gate!" Matteo's voice echoed from the hallway, followed by the booming return fire of his security detail. "It's Lorenzo Borelli's men. They brought a small army boss." Cassian pulled a heavy matte black Glock from the holster at the small of his back. He looked down at Penelope. Her chest was heaving, her beautiful face pale with shock, but she wasn't crying. She was clutching the black onyx brooch so tightly her knuckles were translucent. "Penelope, listen to me," Cassian commanded, his voice eerily calm amidst the gunfire. He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look into his obsidian eyes. "I will burn this entire island to the bedrock before I let a single bullet touch you. Do you understand?" She nodded numbly. "Stay behind the table. Do not move until I say so." Cassian rolled out from behind cover, firing 3 precise shots toward the shattered window. 2 men in tactical gear who had just vaulted into the room dropped to the floor, instantly neutralized. The sheer, terrifying efficiency of his violence made Penelope's breath hitch. This wasn't a businessman. This was a king defending his castle. The library became a war zone. Matteo and 2 other guards breached the room, laying down suppressive fire. Cassian moved with deadly grace, coordinating his men while keeping himself positioned between the attackers and Penelope's hiding spot. "They're pushing the perimeter," Matteo yelled over the din. "We need to fall back to the safe room." Cassian ducked back behind the appraisal table, grabbing Penelope by the arm. "We move now. Keep your head down." Penelope scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Cassian kept his body wrapped tight around her side, practically carrying her as they sprinted through the library doors and into the chaotic hallway. Alarms were blaring, flashing strobe lights casting jagged shadows across the expensive art. They reached the end of the corridor, where a seemingly normal wood-paneled wall awaited. Cassian pressed a bloody palm against a hidden biometric scanner. The wall slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a steel-reinforced bunker. He shoved Penelope inside Matteo, and the guards following close behind, before the heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing them in absolute, terrifying silence. The safe room was stark lit by emergency fluorescent lights. Penelope collapsed against the cold steel wall, finally letting out a ragged sob. The reality of the last 3 minutes crashed over her. She was a jewelry appraiser from Brooklyn. She liked antique cameos and quiet museums. Now she was covered in drywall dust, trapped in a bunker with a Mafia cartel. Cassian slammed his fist against the wall, a string of vicious Italian cursing escaping his lips. He turned, pacing the small room like a caged panther. "Lorenzo is a dead man. I will mount his head on the Throg's neck bridge." He stopped pacing and looked at Penelope. She was trembling, sliding down the wall to sit on the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest. Cassian's fierce expression instantly softened. He crossed the room, dropping to his knees on the cold floor right in front of her. He didn't care that his men were watching. He reached out his blood-stained hands, hovering over her shoulders before gently pulling her into his chest. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair, his massive hand rubbing soothing circles on her back. "You're safe, Penelope. It's over." Penelope rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the rapid, heavy thumping of his heart. She should push him away. She should be terrified of him. He was the reason she almost died. But sitting here, enveloped in his heat and his ferocious protection, she felt an undeniable, twisted spark of belonging. She pulled back slightly, looking up into his dark, obsessive eyes. Slowly she opened her clenched fist. Resting in the center of her palm was the black onyx brooch, perfectly intact. "They didn't get it," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Cassian looked at the piece of jewelry, and then up at the woman holding it. She hadn't dropped it. In the middle of a firefight, terrified for her life, she had protected his prize. She was incredibly soft, beautiful, and utterly unbreakable. A slow, devastating smile spread across Cassian's face. He reached out, taking the brooch from her hand, but his fingers intertwined with hers, locking them together. "No, they didn't," Cassian said, his voice dropping to a dark, possessive purr. "But they made a fatal mistake. They showed you exactly the kind of world I live in. And now that you've survived it." He leaned in his lips, hovering mere inches from hers, the promise of violence and passion swirling in the air between them. "I am never letting you leave." What happens when a fiercely independent appraiser becomes the ultimate prize of a ruthless Mafia kingpin? Penelope thought she could evaluate the diamonds and walk away. But Cassian Romano plays by his own dangerous rules. Will she rule by his side, or will the violent underworld finally tear them apart? If you loved this intense Mafia romance drama, hit that like button, share it with your fellow romance readers, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories.